Clunes Booktown Festival is a celebration of the book, filled with bookstalls, author talks, workshops and thought-provoking conversations in the historic Victorian township of Clunes.
I wish to acknowledge that Creative Clunes is on traditional lands of the Dja Dja Wurrung people. We pay our respects to the elders of these lands and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples past, present and emerging. We recognise them as the original storytellers on the land on which we meet today. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this session. Finally, welcome to this session with Kate Grenville. As you would know by now, Kate has come down with the wretched COVID lurgy, and so she is here. Well, actually, she's here not thanks to the wizardry of Zoom, but thanks to the wizardry of something else. But anyway, Kate, thank you so much for being able to talk to us today, and I hope you're not feeling too dreadful.
Look, I'm getting away with it fairly easily, I think. As you can probably hear, it's probably not much worse than a cold, but I'm still very positive, and I did not want to share my germs with anybody, all my friends at Clune.
Jolly good. Kate, as you would all know, is one of our most significant writers. Her first book, Bearded Ladies, was published just over 40 years ago. But she's been writing, as she told me once, with a view to publication, as she put it, since she was 16. I think she's had 17 books published, with her latest, Unsettled, A Journey Through Time and Place, due out on April the 1st, but available in the Readings book tent today. Among those earlier books are Joan Makes History, Lillian's Story, The Idea of Perfection, which won the Orange Prize in Britain, The Secret River, which was shortlisted for the Booker and won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize. There's also A Room Made of Leaves about Elizabeth MacArthur, One Life, My Mother's Story, and most recently, Restless Dolly Maunder, a novel about her formidable grandmother. The past, history and the voiceless have always had significant parts to play in all of Kate's work, and today, with Unsettled, nothing has changed. And her family, going right back to Solomon Wiseman, who was transported here in 1806 and was the basis for the character of William Thornhill in The Secret River, has played a significant part as well. Indeed, you could say that Kate's family is the gift that has never stopped giving. And when she's written about them, her mother, her grandmother, and others in fiction and non-fiction, making use of her mother's records and stories, she's seen them as representative of millions of other Australian families. But her new book is different. She is firmly in the driving seat, literally, in fact, as she takes the reader on a journey back to the places where her family has lived and mulls over what happened to the First Nations people who were there before them. And I quote from the book, she asks, "What do we do with the fact that we're the beneficiaries of a violent past? All non-Indigenous Australians, no matter when or how they came here, benefit from the fact that this place was taken from the First Nations." Please welcome Kate Grenville. Kate, before we start, I've got lots of questions to ask you, but it might be, I think, perhaps you could read just a fraction of the start of the book to give the idea of it to the audience. Would that be okay?
I'd love to do that because I think there are a lot of books that are written. Look, first of all, I want to acknowledge where I am today, which is on Wurundjeri land of the Kulin Nation, and to acknowledge those storytellers for many millennia in the past. And yes, I will read a tiny bit of the book because I want people to see that the tone of the book is very personal. It's not a history book and it's not kind of solemn. So this is how the book starts. I was 10 or 11 when one day in 1960 or 1961, my class walked down from North Sydney Demonstration School to Bull's Head. I remember us grizzling about having to walk so far. It was hot, the sun blasting down as we trailed along. But when we got there, we saw something that's been burned into my memory ever since. We're standing on the high point at the end of Bull's Head, the harbour glittering bluely. The heat beats back from a great open expanse of flat, bare sandstone in front of us. We're lined up listening to the teacher because we're going to have to answer the questions on our excursion sheet. I'm going to have to draw the thing we've come to see, which is on the ground behind a white painted council fence. The same bright white paint has picked out a big shape engraved on the rock. It's nothing more than a simple outline, a whale or maybe a fish. We're not that impressed except by how big it is. It had been done, Mrs. Lenny was saying, by Aboriginal people. They'd fished in the harbour and they'd made this whale on the rock, not the white paint. Mrs. Lenny made that clear. They'd just done the groove in the rock to make the picture. We'd put the paint around it so you could see it better, and we'd put the fence there because it was special. I'd like to be able to say that looking at that whale on the rock was the first moment that Aboriginal people became real to me. I'd like to say it was the start of a lifetime's uncomfortable knowledge. I could pretend I felt sad or puzzled or curious or sorry, but the truth is, I don't remember what I felt. Only that of the millions of things I saw when I was 10 or 11, that's one of the very few I remember. I must have felt something, but I'd be lying if I said I knew what. Still, that piercing visual memory lodged in me like a splinter. So that's really where this book started, my chance visit to a place I had last seen, age 10 or something. And life is so strange. I don't know why I went to see that engraving, but I just followed the little voice in me that said, go and have another look at that engraving. And it was because I was there that this book just began to unfold, not so much the book as the project, the road trip. So I think one should, as Jung says, follow one's bliss and follow one's instinct with these things.
You said, Kate, you said to me in an email exchange this week that in a way it was a book that you didn't want to write because it was too difficult and possibly too provocative. But you also said that it couldn't be resisted. Why is that?
Yes, that's right. Look, the reasons for not writing, this is a book. Okay, to go back to the beginning, my ancestors go back 4 generations in this country, and on each of those generations, they were on the leading edge of the frontier. They kept pushing out as colonists pushed out from Sydney. And for each generation, there's a little snippet of family story, which my mother very conscientiously passed on to me. And I've always known those stories. I've used them in the fiction that I've been writing for the last 20 years, starting, I suppose, with The Secret River. I've used them as the basis for fiction. But now I felt that I needed to come out from behind the screen of fiction and be just me, confronting the fact that my ancestors had taken land all over New South Wales, specific bits of land that I could identify. And I decided to go and stand on those very bits of land and acknowledge to myself the kind of physical reality of the fact that they had been stolen. I was on stolen land, so that phrase no longer became an abstraction, but a reality. Now, I knew that was going to be difficult because, first of all, it's very confronting to do that. It's a whole lot easier just to say, oh, look, it wasn't me that did it, and perhaps my people didn't do anything bad. It's very confronting to have to deal with the utter brutality and kind of horrifying things that happened. You can think, I will be overwhelmed if I let them in. I'm not even going to start thinking about them. So that was one reason for resisting, not a very honourable one. But there were other better reasons. And one was that it put white people at the centre again. It would put me again at the centre of a story that involved Aboriginal people. And that's what we've been doing for 200 years. I kind of didn't want to do that. Be the colonists telling the story yet again. But I also thought this kind of soul searching is what we're up to now, us non-Indigenous Australians. We have to do it, and no matter how uncomfortable it has to be done. And it was a book that simply more or less wrote itself. I've never quite had that experience of being taken over by something kind of larger than me. That is a conviction that justice needs to be done, and justice needs to start by telling the story truthfully. So yes, it works. And of course, as for being provocative, The Secret River provoked all kinds of trouble. And I I'm not a person who likes a fight, so I'm not keen to rush back into that. But this book, for me, had to be written, so I've written it.
As you say, it is a very personal book, and so you describe it as a pilgrimage, don't you?
That's how it felt in my grander moments. I called it a pilgrimage. As at one point in the journey, I thought that was a rather precious, even pretentious way of thinking about it. It was certainly what I wanted to do was to open up a way of thinking about these problems. What does it mean to be descended from those people? But also, what does it mean for any of us, even recent arrivals, to be benefiting from the fact that the country was stolen? What does that mean? It's a hard question to even sort of think about. And I wanted to put myself in a kind of perhaps meditative, but also a rather grand term, but a frame of mind where I would allow any thoughts that came to me to come in uncensored, because at this point it wasn't a book, it really was just a road trip, and to follow them wherever they took me, to do a kind of sort of like what you do when you go to an analyst, basically. Let it all hang out and see where it takes you.
So when you set off, I mean, it is a journey. You drive to these places, starting at Wiseman's Ferry. At that stage, it wasn't going to be a book.
No, it was probably going to join a huge folder of notes that I'd been taking for something like 25 years. When I was writing The Secret River, I went to several of the places where the family story happened as background for that novel. And of course, I took lots of notes, I took photographs. Then a few years later, I wrote a book about my mother. And I then went to more of the places where the family story happened in order to fill out the thing for her. And then a few years ago, I wrote a book about my grandmother. I am really, squeezing every drop of juice out of my family stories. And so I went then and took more notes. So over the years, I've developed, quite a big pile of notes. So that's where this book began. It was going to be just more notes to add to that journey, which I personally had to take. And I was very, well, let's face it, apprehensive about kind of sharing with anybody. I didn't tell anybody what I was doing. I just kind of took off. And I was pleased not to have to try and explain it because I didn't know what was going to happen. That was the point.
So there's early on in the book, you write about Solomon Wiseman, who, as I mentioned in the introduction, was the sort of basis for William Thornhill, and you make the point about how when he was freed and he then took up land at what is now called Wiseman's Ferry. That's a very loaded phrase, took up, and all the way through Unsettled, you are very attuned to the different meanings in language and how the colonists are described and how they describe what they're doing. So took up land, then to names of places. There are coded messages in the names, but there are also unspoken details in a phrase like took up land. Would you talk to us a bit about that, please?
Yes, it was one of the things that surprised me as I drove along, veering off to take notes from time to time, how words and language were becoming actually quite a central part of this. I mean, this is about retelling a story that has been told kind of dishonestly, let's face it, for 200 years. The story of British, the colonists taking the place from the indigenous people. I'm not the first person to have noted, in fact, I've noted it myself in a previous book, that little word up in take up makes it sound quite different, very innocent. If you take something, it's a grab. I'm going to take this land. But if you take something up, you take up a piece of unfinished knitting or a suggestion. There's a suggestion, but quite a benign thing to do, even a good thing to do. So that was the first of many times in the book where I'd kind of deconstructed language. Let me try and think of another one. Maybe you can, Jason. I got very interested in, for example, the names on gates in the country. And of course, as you say, the coded messages in a lot of place names. For example, Jump Up Creek, which is somewhere up near Cessnock from memory, which I passed. And I thought, oh, jump up. That means either run away or resurrection after death when I researched it, either of which is a kind of coded message for what probably happened beside that creek. Waterloo Creek up near Mile Creek. Again, they met their Waterloo. Well, we know who met it, but it's coded. So it pleased me very much to deconstruct the very language that we've been using to tell this story, not just to tell the story differently, but to critique the actual words that we're using to tell it.
And then there was, of course, the way the land was distributed, if you like. There are the grants of land, selection, improvements, even alienation.
Yes, that's right. The legality. I mean, what it seemed to me was that there was this enormous, elaborate, kind of Baroque superstructure of fancy language on top of an original falsehood, so that there's this falsehood that, the British owned half of Australia. But on top of that, they then built this enormous camouflage of legal and pseudo-legalistic language, a grant of land, alienating land. Now, that's a really interesting one. When land is actually bought and sold, as my uncle actually bought a piece of land, as opposed to it being a grant or a lease, it's described as being alienated which means from the crown. The king no longer owns it, or the queen. But of course, in another sense, it is so true because it has been alienated from the people it's belonged to, and those people have been alienated from their own country. So it fascinated me the way there are so many layers of the concealment of the concealment of what we did, so many ways to kind of fudge it.
But as you set off, Kate, you made a decision not really to sort of connect with people and converse with them on the way. Why was that?
That's right. Look, at the beginning, I didn't know what I was doing, and I didn't want to have to try and clarify it because I didn't want it to be clear. I wanted it to be as open-ended as a dream, really, or an analysis going to a shrink and seeing that. But one of my very first encounters was with a woman at Wiseman's Ferry, who we had a short conversation, but I was rejecting her friendly overtures because I wanted to kind of keep this internal thing going. But as I left the little shop, I thought, my gosh, she could be an Aboriginal woman. And at that point, I had to decide what I was going to do with this book. So I thought about it long and hard, not just then, but at all points on the journey. And I decided that, look, essentially, this is our problem as non-Indigenous Australians. We are constantly going to Indigenous people to ask them for things, information, stories, access to their world. But this is something that is not their problem. The problem of us having to wear the guilt, really, or the responsibility for what happened in the past is not their problem, and they shouldn't be asked to help us deal with it. I have, of course, consulted with and spoken to and friends with Aboriginal people, but this just seemed a kind of soul searching that I personally needed to do on my own. That seemed the more honourable way, because I then thought, if I were to talk to First Nations people everywhere I went, what would our conversations be? Our conversations would basically be, let's talk about the terrible things that my ancestors may have done to your ancestors. Now, that to me is to trespass, to blunder into somebody else's pain and sensitivity. So they're the reasons I did it. I may have been wrong about that, and maybe I'll write another book where I do it differently. But that's the choice I made, for better or worse.
But it's not, the book is not entirely, you use your imagination in it, don't you? Because you're reflecting on the past when you go to various places, you are bringing in it's not exactly fiction making in the sense that which you brought in obviously with all your novels, but the imagination does play a big role in this book.
Yes. Look, I am a fiction writer after all, and my way of trying to understand the past has always been by a sort of imaginative or empathic connection. My pattern has always been to do as much research as I possibly can into the actual, the historical facts, if we can call them that, of what happened. But then to kind of float above that, well, let's not use the word above, to float beside that with an imaginative engagement with it, which it's the only way I can make sense of it. I'm not a historian. I can't do it that way, and I'm terribly pleased that they do. I could not have written this book without historians. So I owe them a great deal. But I think for something like this, which is a kind of moral dilemma with no easy kind of answer, there's no black and white thing here, and there are no facts to establish. It's a murky thing about the human heart, practically, and the human sense of where we belong and what right we might have to belong there, if we have a right. It's a questioning thing. And look, frankly, it's the only thing I can do. I am a novelist, and that's trying to understand things by conjuring up an imaginative picture of it. That's the way I think, and it's the only way I seem to be able to think.
And let's jump ahead, Kate, to you've written the book, or you've finished your pilgrimage, if you like, and you have then processed your experiences and turned it into Unsettled. How did you change during the pilgrimage and then during the writing of the book?
Oh, what a good question. Look, this journey, the journey described in this book is just the beginning of the journey for me, I now realise. Even since I finally sent the final draft to the publishers, I was already starting to rethink and, have different thoughts about it. What happened during the writing is that I allowed myself to imagine my way into the situation beyond I realised that I was going far beyond my knowledge. For example, I was trying to imagine my way into what it might have actually been like to be First Nations people living on those lands. As I wrote the book, and particularly as I edited it, and particularly as very helpful people advised me and commented on it, I realised that I had to step back from that. It's very satisfying to think that you're imagining something and it's kind of true. The fact is it's not. It's just your imagination. There has to be a kind of humility to this, a kind of diffidence about it. This is, after all, I am not only walking on stolen land, but, walking around the edges of other people's stories. I learned humility, I think, after I'd written it in a great burst of, aren't I, isn't this wonderful? Isn't this good fun? And I stepped right back from that. And so I still have allowed myself just now and again to imagine my way to that other world. But I have then said, yes, imagine away, by all means. Just don't mistake it for the reality. Just don't think you're right. This is just you making it up. And that's what you do as a novelist.
And so that is the personal aspect very much of the book, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. And of course, beyond that, the book also pushed me, particularly certain readers, challenged me to think harder about things like, for example, treaty, which I had always thought, that's too hard. I don't understand any of that. I'm not going to go there. But the other thing that I learned about in writing the book was that actually these things are not too hard. And, you might not come to the correct conclusion, but it is up to us all to try and kind of understand those things, face that challenge. So I'm now much less kind of arm's length about trying to understand those big, what you might call political issues as well, even though there's not very much of that in the book. But the book was like the opening for me to think, okay, I'm not frightened of any of this now. And I have a responsibility, I think, as a non-Indigenous person, to actually engage with this whole situation and try and make it better, work towards justice in whatever way I can.
I know you refer in the book to New Zealand and the fact that there was a treaty in New Zealand with the Maori people. And that's it, in the course of discussing, this is a language question, that is in the course of discussing what should non-Indigenous Australians be referred to in the way that New Zealanders refer to them as peka. And you plumped for the word balanda.
Yes.
And perhaps, there are other words, but you think balanda is, where does the word balanda come from?
I pronounce it balanda. I'm not sure if that's correct, but anyway, the word, look, there are many words for non-Indigenous people in Indigenous languages, in First Nations languages. But of course, they are all different words from different groups. So the problem with using a word is that you then exclude all the other language groups. The clever thing about the word Pākehā in New Zealand is that it's actually possibly derived from an English word, porker, of the sealers who used to leave pigs on New Zealand islands as a food resource when they came back the following year. So it's thought that porker has become the Maori word, Pākehā. Now that seems to me fabulously elegant. It's like the Maori have taken over, have colonised, if you like, that word. And now non-Indigenous New Zealanders are prepared to call themselves that. We need something like that. Balanda is, look, it's not going to happen, but I like it. Balanda is what the Makassar traders, people from an Indonesian island, used to trade with the northern parts of Australia for centuries before Captain Cook. And they were themselves being colonised by the Dutch or Hollanders. The Dutch called themselves Hollanders. And so the Macassans called those colonising people Balanda as a kind of, distortion of Hollander. And that's what a lot of Northern Australian Aboriginal people call us white people, Islander, particularly in the far north. And that seems to me have the same kind of elegance as Pākehā. It's actually a word from the colonists that has been taken over and colonised and then kind of given back to us. I don't imagine it'll happen, but it seems to me quite a good. The problem with non-Indigenous is that it suggests that we're the default from which all other groups deviate. And I think that's wrong. I think we need to label ourselves as an acknowledgement that we are just one of the many. We're not the default. We just take our place among the other people here.
During the course of writing the book, though, what I liked about it very much is, you write about your own doubts as you're going along. At one stage, you're at a place called Jerry's Plains, and you write, that question, what do we do now that we know, needs to be asked, but maybe this journey isn't the right way to ask it.
Yes, very much so. I nearly gave up, nearly abandoned the whole thing at that stage. I had set out with these grand thoughts of a pilgrimage. I had hit Jerry's Plains, which is in the Hunter Valley, which is a place of remarkable devastation from the coal mines, a land entirely destroyed, unrecognisable from what First Nations people would have seen. And it was a horrifying and kind of disgusting feeling. And I was disgusted with myself too. I thought, I'm doing something here that's kind of maybe a bit self-indulgent, maybe trivial. What point is there? It's almost insulting and certainly insulting to call it anything as grand as a pilgrimage in the face of this landscape-wide devastation and damage. So I did it. I remember there was a particular crossroads where I could either give up and go home, turn left, or keep going and turn right. And just at the moment when I was about to, I suspect, give up and go home, turn left, one of the many utes up there, a big monstering ute, came up behind me. I knew that the guy was just about to give me a great blast on the horn. Come on, old lady, make up your mind. And something in that moment made me turn right rather than left, and I continued on the trip. And I am so glad I did. I would have felt that I had betrayed not just myself, but something much bigger than me if I'd given up. But yeah, look, there's been no point at which I have been sure that this was a good thing to do. It was just the only way that I personally seemed to be able to come to those unanswerable questions. Like, okay, if you're on stolen land, what do you do about it? We're not going to give it back. I'm not going to sail away back to England. I have nowhere to go back to there. So, but on the other hand, it's not right to just pretend nothing happened in the past. It's like a stalemate. It's like a circular argument. This was the one way that I felt I could at least open it up to being looked at. Other people would do it differently.
Do you now think that, given that the voice referendum failed, as inevitably it was going to when after it wasn't a bipartisan thing, do you think a treaty is the best way to go now, if it's possible?
Look, I think, first of all, the word treaty is kind of loaded because in most people's mind, including mine until I did a bit of research, a treaty is between warring parties. And of course, we are not at war here in Australia. So the word is, in fact, a treaty simply means any kind of legally binding agreement. A peace treaty is only one kind of treaty. So there's a problem, I think, with the word in the sense that it conjures up a picture which is not quite right. But I definitely think that some kind of agreement, some kind of formal agreement between, entities that are, that have rights and sovereignty, that is essential as a first step. And virtually all other British colonies had that. They didn't amount to much, but they do give people a starting point, as the Treaty of Waitangi in New Zealand was terrible in all sorts of ways, but it can now be revisited, dusted off, as a New Zealander described it the other day, revisited, and it gives you a place to start talking. We don't have anywhere to start talking here. So even if an agreement, call it a treaty if you like, is, inadequate or provisional, it at least gives a place to start a dialogue. And that's essential. Without that, we'll limp on forever with part of our nation feeling, and rightly, angry, hurt, and, sidelined, and non-Indigenous Australians feeling sort of uneasy, unsettled, if you like, uncomfortable and unable really to look at the facts of the matter. So, yes, I suspect that it would be better to call it something other than a treaty, but that's somebody else's decision.
But it is something that should be. I think the Victorian government is negotiating some sort of treaty. I think, but
absolutely, they have an assembly and they have a path to treaty. Yes,
yeah. But there needs to be a national one, doesn't there? Really. So there's a lot about belonging. The idea of belonging. Now, the First Nations people belonged to this country, and they looked after the country, they nurtured it. How do non-Indigenous Australians, to use that phrase again, how do we come to a feeling of belonging here?
Look, I think the short answer is not quickly and not easily. I think there is a journey to be gone through to feel that we belong. I think perhaps there's a feeling that we've kind of leapfrogged over the hard bit. We arrived here, whether in 1806 like me, or I don't know how long ago you arrived here, but we then leapfrogged over the difficult bit and say, right, we belong here now. Some work has to be done, I think, and I suspect a lot of people will feel a different kind of work needs to be done. A metaphorical journey needs to be taken, and that includes, of course, finding out about the past, telling the truth about it, and being prepared to accept it, even though it's actually very kind of painful and confronting to do it. So I think the journey to belonging has to be a journey, and it has to take in some fairly sobering and somber parts of our past. The book ends, as you would know, with the Myall Creek Massacre Memorial. That seems to me an incredible model for what we might do. In that town, descendants of a famous massacre, descendants of the survivors and descendants of the perpetrators got together over somebody's kitchen table, it goes, and talked it through, admitted what had happened, talked it through, and came up with this memorial, which is an extraordinary model for the kind of talking something through and arriving at a point where we can go forward. It's been done in that little tiny town of Bingara, northern New South Wales. It would be fabulous to see it happen all over Australia.
I don't know. I'm assuming that everybody knows about the Myall Creek Massacre, but Kate, would you just tell us quickly what happened?
Yes, and I'll preface it by saying my family didn't actually have anything to do with it, but that's irrelevant. I think we're all kind of part of that. 1838, it's been well documented because it's one of the few occasions when white men were taken to court, and in fact 7 of them were hanged for the murder of something like nearly 40 defenceless Aboriginal people, women, old men, children. They were murdered in cold blood over a long day of premeditated violence. So it's one of the more brutal. There would have been plenty of events like that, but for various reasons, this is one of the very few that has a good paper trail, which is what we need to establish the past, or one of the things we need, in the form of a court case. And that's perhaps why the memorial is one of the few places in Australia where you can actually go and, as you can go to the cenotaph and pay homage to our dead soldiers. The Mile Creek Massacre Memorial is one of the few places where a non-Indigenous person or an Indigenous person can go and actually be in a place where that has been fully acknowledged. It was a horrendous, barbarous thing back in 1838. But all these years later, it has actually, it shows what's possible. It shows that now, all these years later, we can actually stop putting all that stuff in the dark, the dark cupboard, get it out of the cupboard, shine the light on it, and then we can go forward together.
It's a very, very good place, a spot at which to end the book. During the course of your pilgrimage, Kate, you discovered more things about your family. Was that very uncomfortable for you?
Yes. Look, I'd always thought that my great-great-grandfather was a publican. He started the pub at a little town called Currabubula. And that's not true. That's not untrue. He was the publican there. But what I did not know until I'd started the research for this book that recently is that he was also a squatter. And as anybody knows who's read any of the history of 19th century Australia, it was the squatters who did most of the unrecorded violence towards Aboriginal people because they so desperately wanted to take their land. Now, when I discovered that John Martin Davis was not just a smiling publican doling up the beer, but was also a squatter, mounted on his thoroughbred and dealing with the First Nations people at Pialaway in a way that I do not, there's no record of it. That appalled me. It appalled me that he had been that, of course, but what appalled me more is that I had actually, that fact had been hiding in plain sight in the family stories, and I had been ignoring it. I had been deliberately not hearing that particular little clue in the family story for all those years, for my whole life. I had been disregarding that clue, and that horrified me all the more, and it told me that, as bad as the horrifying things are, almost worse is the human capacity to turn our back on them. And I had done that. That was a source of huge grief and horror. And look, it really shook me, and it made me look at myself and my evasions, in a new way, and hopefully have kind of been prepared to look at them.
So you write around when you're writing about the great grandfather Davis, you say you don't feel guilt, but you feel incredibly uncomfortable about benefiting from a great wrong that you of course didn't commit, and which is what everybody who reads the book could feel.
Yes, that's right. Look, the word guilt. You can dismiss guilt. You can say, "Oh, it's not for us to feel guilty because we didn't do it." Now, that seems to me a bit of sophistry, really. Guilt may not be precisely the right word. I say in the book what I think about guilt, which is that guilt suggests its opposite, innocence. And guilt also suggests that you can kind of compensate for guilt or, pay a price for it or somehow expunge it by and turn it into its opposite. Whereas I think what I'm left with here is nothing as clear as that. It's not that I can, pay penance and sort of have paid my dues and move on. For me, that knowledge that I have benefited from terrible wrongs is simply something that I have to wear. It's something I have to accept as part of my identity, not a part I'm pleased about. I wish it wasn't there, but it is there, and I'm not going to deny it. That sense of responsibility for the past is part of who I am, and part of what my belonging to this country is about.
So in a sense, the pilgrimage, it didn't allow, you emerge from the pilgrimage not having purged that feeling, but having almost embraced it to carry with you.
That's really well put. That's exactly right. Definitely not expunged, but yes, embraced. It is part of who I and every non-Indigenous person who I am, and we all are. We have to embrace it as part of who we are. And once we've done that, it's kind of, there's a sense in which we're no longer paralysed. I mean, I think the failure of the referendum was the fact that we had sent all this stuff underground. We were too, timid to get it out and look at it. And not surprisingly, it's terrible stuff to look at. But once you look at it, you are not freed, but you are free from the paralysis. And you can then start to think about things like, what do we actually do? Is there something in terms of legislation, policy that we can actually try to set up mechanisms to make things better? So, yes, it was a strange journey, and it was strange writing the book. I'm terribly pleased I did.
So are we. Kate, at least you didn't discover the sort of things that David Marr discovered in his book.
No, although they may well be there. I mean, my family was kind of a bit lower down the social pecking order than David's, so there's much less recorded. Apart from John Martin Davis, they were pretty much all illiterate. I really admire David's book and admire David for going into every tiny little blood-soaked detail of his family's history. I don't think I could have done that. I think I've done something in a way easier. I've been more exposed about what it meant for me personally. But I think, I mean, it's interesting. David's book came out, I was already well into this book. It's like the zeitgeist carries with it a certain kind of logic, and I think there are probably going to be quite a few books like this. And I think the referendum, I think we can actually, in a funny way, perhaps thank the referendum for that. It jolted a lot of people, including me, out of the sense that actually, Australia was moving in the right direction in terms of justice for the First Nations. Actually, we were not, and we won't until more truths are told and truly accepted.
That's a very interesting point. And Kate, having written this now, how does this affect your future writing? What will you? You're somebody who writes all the time, so you're probably thinking about other projects and everything. But will this change what you write?
Look, it's already changed everything about the way I feel about being myself. Actually, it's been a journey of self-examination in a way, not so much self-discovery. Look, I have a couple of bottom drawer books, which I had been planning to get back to. And now I think, are they really important enough? Because I feel as if I have been into an important area and these bottom drawer ones. So the short answer is, Jason, I don't really know. I will get the bottom drawer books out and see if there's something about them. But it may be, look, I'm 74. This could be the last one. Although people who know me say, oh, you always say that.
I think, I'm sure I've heard you say that, actually. Well, I hope not. Now, Kate, we might try to open up to questions from the audience. I will just ask you one question, though, because this is something that you talk about in the book, about what prompted you to write The Secret River and to think about your family history. And that was when you met Melissa Lukashenko for the first time. And she asked you a very significant question.
Yes, I met her in London. We were both in London for some kind of gab fest about the centenary of Federation. We were there courtesy of John Howard. Thank you, Mr. Howard. And Melissa and I had never met her before. We went and had a coffee, and we sat down, and she said to me, "Where's your mob from? Where's your mob from?" No. And I was absolutely sort of blindsided. I could not answer her. I was at that point researching Solomon Wiseman, who, of course, came from London. So did she mean Was I from London? Was I from England? Or did she mean Currabubula, where my great-grandfather had the pub? Or from North Sydney, where I grew up? What did it mean? What should I say to her? So I stumbled and stammered and, made a complete idiot of myself. And the question resonated with me, as many things that Melissa has said have resonated with me over the years and have made me think about things that sometimes it's a little bit hard to think about. And I realized finally that was the central question. Where is my mob from, in the sense of where do I belong and how do I belong there? What is my right of belonging here? So in many ways, that question that Melissa asked me back in 2000 it certainly went right to the heart of the book that I was researching then, The Secret River, but it's also, after all these years, still a question that resonates behind this one. I thank Melissa for not only for that question, but many others that she's asked me over the years, because they're hard questions and I often have resisted them, but I have come to realise that they are the way into a better and a way of thinking that takes me further.
All right. Well, Kate, I think we're going to have to wrap this session up now. I would thank you so much for talking to us, given your COVID positive status. I hope you feel better quickly. I hope you get on the road to talk a lot more about Unsettled, which is a very, very impressive and moving book. So, Kate Grenville, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you, Jason, and thank you for the unsung audience.
Clunes Booktown Festival is presented by Creative Clunes. Tax-deductible donations to keep our stories alive can be made at creativeclunes.org.au. This podcast has been made possible due to the generous support of the Hugh Williamson Foundation.